Mark Jeffrey Dribbin was a 42-year-old United Airlines cargo worker at Portland International Airport who vanished without a trace in July 1999. Born on April 13, 1957, Mark was described as a responsible employee who stood at 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 160 pounds with green hazel eyes. At the time of his disappearance, he sported a mustache and small goatee. He lived alone in a house located in the 3000 block of Northeast 137th Avenue in Portland, Oregon. His life appeared routine and stable, with no indication of the violent end that awaited him. Another key individual in this case is Kenneth Griffin, a 53-year-old part-time roofer who grew up in Portland as one of 6 siblings. Unlike Mark, Griffin had experienced periods of homelessness but was living with roommates at the time of his disappearance in February 2020. Despite his transient lifestyle, Griffin maintained close family connections and was expected at his mother's house for dinner on February 16, 2020. On July 2, 1999, Mark made his last official communication with anyone by calling his employer at United Airlines. He requested the night off due to what he described as a personal emergency. This phone call was completely out of character for Mark, who was known as an exceptionally reliable worker who rarely missed shifts or requested time off unexpectedly. On July 3rd, Mark was last definitively seen at the Eagle Tavern on Southwest 13th Avenue and Burnside Street in Portland. When Mark failed to report for work on July 6th and couldn't be reached by phone, concerned colleagues and family members reported him missing to the Portland Police Bureau. On July 18th, his vehicle was located abandoned near Southeast 43rd Avenue and Division Street in Portland. The location was significant because investigators determined that Mark did not typically frequent this area, suggesting his car had been deliberately moved there. The vehicle's placement indicated premeditation and an attempt to mislead investigators. During the summer of 1999, investigators conducted a thorough search of Mark's residence and made several disturbing discoveries. They found blood spatters on the walls throughout the house and clear evidence that someone had attempted to clean up a violent crime scene. The forensic evidence suggested that he had been murdered or attacked inside his own home, and the perpetrator had made efforts to remove evidence of the crime. Crucially, investigators recovered DNA evidence from an unknown suspect both inside Mark's house and in his abandoned vehicle. On August 11, 2000, after more than a year of investigation with no significant leads, the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office issued a presumptive death certificate for Mark. With no body recovered and no viable suspects identified, the criminal homicide investigation officially went cold. The DNA evidence was preserved and entered into the CODIS database, but no matches were found. And before we're able to continue with Mark's case, we first have to discuss Kenneth Griffin. He was last seen alive on February 1st, 2020. When Griffin failed to appear for dinner at his mother's house as planned on February 2nd, family members immediately became concerned and reported him missing to police. For several months, there would be no sign of the missing man. However, in the midst of an investigation into a man named Christopher Lovrian, officials made a disturbing discovery. On May 19, 2020, detectives conducting a search of Lovrian's shed found Kenneth Griffin's dismembered remains inside 3 plastic totes. The discovery was made possible by an unusual circumstance. Lovrian's attorney at the time had actually invited police to search the outbuildings, advising them to bring a hazmat team. This invitation proved to be the undoing of Lovrian's attempt to conceal Griffin's murder. On May 21st, the medical examiner officially matched the remains to Griffin and his death was ruled a homicide. It was later revealed in court that Griffin and Lovrian had stumbled upon each other at the 82nd Street Bar and Grill. Lovrian was celebrating a gambling win and lured Griffin to his home by offering to share his winnings with him. Back in November of 2019, investigators had already began investigating Lovrian in regards to Mark's death. His first interview occurred just months before Griffin's disappearance, suggesting that the renewed attention on Mark's case may have triggered Lovrian's second murder. The timing raises disturbing questions about whether Griffin's death could have been prevented if Lovrian had been arrested immediately after the November 2019 interview. On April 16, 2020, police obtained a court-authorized search warrant for a sample of Lovrian's DNA. Several weeks later, the Multnomah County Grand Jury indicted Lovrian for the murder of Mark Dreibin, and an arrest warrant was issued. The DNA comparison had confirmed that Lovrian was the source of the genetic material found at Mark's home and in his vehicle. On May 6th, investigators conducted an initial search of Lovrian's house in southeast Portland. During the search, they discovered an arsenal of firearms, including several pistols, revolvers, and rifles. The weapons collection would later form the basis for additional charges against Lovrian as a felon in possession of firearms. As for his background, Lovrian was 53 years old when he was arrested in 2020. He worked as a metal fabricator and spent most of his time alone. Perhaps most disturbing were Lovrian's own statements about the murders, captured in recorded jail calls and grand jury testimony. In a recorded call to his brother from jail, he ominously stated, "There is more to this than has been revealed, and it's bad." This statement suggested that investigators might have only scratched the surface of his criminal activities. Regarding Mark, according to grand jury testimony, Lovrian claimed he met him at an adult bookstore and had sold him illegal substances on several occasions. Lovrian alleged that Mark made an unwelcome advance, which supposedly triggered the killing. He stated that he disposed of Mark's body on Larch Mountain, though the remains have never been recovered despite searches of the area. As for Griffin, Lovrian stated that he took his life with an axe, then proceeded to shoot him 5 times with a crossbow. Afterward, he took a week off from work and made plans to dispose of Griffin's remains in a river using his boat. However, he claimed he became depressed and never followed through with the disposal plan, instead keeping the remains in his shed. Lovrian callously remarked, "Easy, cheesy, nobody would have known nothing." On January 12, 2024, Lovrian entered into a negotiated plea agreement for Mark's murder. He pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Then in April of the same year, Lovrian stood trial for Kenneth Griffin's murder. In an unusual move, he initially served as his own attorney for most of the trial, but did not call witnesses, take the stand himself, or deliver an opening statement. But eventually, a defense attorney was assigned to him. Ultimately, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 26 years for Griffin's murder. Dorothy Donovan was born on May 18, 1921 in Burrsville, Maryland. She was a 70-year-old grandmother who lived on a 163-acre farm on Killens Pond Road near Harrington, Delaware. Throughout her life, she experienced numerous tragic instances. In the 1940s, she married Wallace Holden, and together they had 3 children named Charles, Diana, and Brenda. However, in 1958, when their children were ages 8, 7, and 4, Wallace died of a heart attack at 44 years old. A few years later, Dorothy remarried to farmer Ralph Donovan, but she was widowed again when Ralph died of a stroke in 1987. At the time of her murder, Dorothy maintained an extremely close relationship with her adult children. She called her daughters twice daily and continued the routine of packing lunch for her 41-year-old son Charles, who worked at a local factory. Charles lived in a trailer approximately 60 feet away from Dorothy's farmhouse on the same property. Dorothy would stay awake each night waiting for Charles to return home from his work shifts, demonstrating the tight-knit nature of their relationship. The evening of Saturday, June 22, 1991 began as normal for Charles Holden, though it would become the most harrowing night of his life. Charles had completed his regular shift that ran from 4 p.m. to midnight at his factory job. Every night, Dorothy would stay awake waiting for Charles to return home. After clocking out shortly before midnight, Charles made an irregular out-of-routine decision. Around 12:30 a.m. on Sunday, June 23, 1991, he stopped at the Hardee's restaurant located at the intersection of US Highway 13 and State Highway 14 in Harrington. Charles wanted to grab a quick meal before heading home. He ordered coffee and a hamburger. As Charles returned to his vehicle in the Hardee's parking lot, a stranger approached him. The man was African American, described as being in his late 20s to early 30s, approximately 5 feet 8 inches in height with a slender build. He had a pockmarked face and wore distinctive plastic-framed glasses with oversized lenses that would later prove crucial in his identification. The man's overall appearance suggested someone who had been living rough, and witnesses would later note that he appeared to be under the influence of substances. The hitchhiker approached Charles with what seemed like a genuine plea for help. He claimed that his sister had just had a baby and was at Milford Hospital, and he desperately needed to get there as soon as possible. He appeared frantic and emotional, playing up the urgency of his situation. Charles was initially cautious. It was after midnight, he was tired from his shift, and he didn't know this stranger. He initially declined to give the man a ride, explaining that it was late. However, the hitchhiker was persistent and increasingly hysterical in his pleas. He continued to emphasize the emergency nature of his situation and the importance of getting to the hospital immediately. Ultimately, the man's emotional manipulation worked. Charles began to feel sympathy and agreed to give the man a partial ride to the hospital. The stranger eagerly accepted this offer, appearing grateful for any assistance. The two men got into Charles's truck with the hitchhiker settling into the passenger seat. As they began driving, Charles attempted to make conversation, perhaps trying to be friendly or simply to fill the awkward silence of driving with a stranger in the early morning hours. The hitchhiker had mentioned his sister's baby, so Charles asked a natural follow-up question. "How long has your sister been pregnant?" This innocent question seemed to catch the hitchhiker off guard, and Charles immediately began to sense that something was wrong with the man's story. The hitchhiker's response was evasive and inconsistent, causing Charles to start having second thoughts about his decision to help. Charles began experiencing what he would later describe as, quote, the whole thought spiral of, oh no, who did I just let into my car, and does he even have a sister? As they drove down the highway, covering approximately 3 miles from the restaurant, the atmosphere in the truck became increasingly tense. Charles was growing more suspicious and uncomfortable, while the hitchhiker may have been sensing Charles's growing wariness. After driving for about 3 miles, Charles reached the intersection of Killens Pond Road and Delaware Route 14, the point where he would normally turn to head toward his home. Charles pulled over and informed the hitchhiker that this was as far as he was willing to take him. In his fury, the hitchhiker grabbed a screwdriver that had been sitting on the floor of Charles's truck. The man began swinging the screwdriver at Charles, attempting to strike him. The confined space of the truck's cab made the attack even more terrifying, as Charles had limited room to defend himself or escape. The hitchhiker's demands escalated beyond simply completing the ride. He now wanted Charles's money and threatened to take his truck. The man's substance-fueled state made him increasingly unpredictable and dangerous, as he made threats against Charles's life. Recognizing the immediate danger he was in, Charles exited the vehicle. At this point, both men got out of the truck, with the fight continuing on the road. Charles, faced with this life-threatening situation, attempted to reach a nearby business called Blake's Garage for help. He ran toward the establishment, hoping to find someone who could assist him or at least provide a safe haven from his attacker. However, given that it was well after midnight, the garage was closed and dark, with no one available to help. Charles found himself banging on the windows and doors of the closed business, desperately trying to rouse someone inside, but to no avail. The man pursued Charles to the garage, still wielding the screwdriver and becoming increasingly agitated. He caught up with Charles before he could reach safety, and he continued to threaten to kill him. Faced with the immediate threat of death or serious injury, Charles made a decision. He agreed to the demands, telling him that he would take him wherever he wanted to go and pleading with him to calm down. The man's rage subsided somewhat, and he agreed to return to the truck to continue their journey. As the two men walked back toward the truck, Charles was frantically trying to devise an escape plan. He knew that actually driving the hitchhiker to his destination would likely end in robbery, assault, or worse. When they were yards away from the truck, Charles made his move. He suddenly broke into a sprint toward his vehicle, catching the hitchhiker completely off guard. Charles reached the truck, yanked open the driver's side door, and jumped inside before the hitchhiker could react. He quickly started the engine and began to drive away, leaving his attacker stranded at the intersection. As he drove off, the hitchhiker began running after the truck, still carrying the screwdriver. Charles could see the man in his rearview mirror following him down the road while swinging the screwdriver over his head. However, the hitchhiker could not maintain his pursuit for long. Charles continued driving until he was confident that he had lost his pursuer, finally able to breathe again but still deeply shaken by the encounter. Rather than heading directly home after his escape, he chose to drive around for approximately 20 minutes before returning to his property so that he could be absolutely sure that the attacker wasn't somehow tailing him. Once he finally felt safe enough to return home, he drove toward his trailer, which was located approximately 60 feet away from his mother Dorothy's farmhouse. As he approached his residence, he was horrified to see a figure that looked disturbingly familiar. The same hitchhiker he had just escaped from was now prowling around his property. Deeply disturbed, Charles drove away from the property. At approximately 1:19 a.m., he called Delaware State Police from a payphone at the Hardee's restaurant where the incident had begun. He explained the situation about the attacker roaming his residence, but authorities treated it as a low priority. This decision would turn out to have tragic consequences. As a result, police did not arrive at the scene until 3 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the initial call. Shortly after the investigation commenced, Charles's mother Dorothy was found dead. Officials first examined Charles's trailer, which appeared untouched. However, when they approached Dorothy's farmhouse, they discovered that a window in the back door had been shattered, with glass scattered on the ground. Inside the bedroom, they made the horrific discovery of Dorothy Donovan's body. She had been stabbed more than 24 times, with sources indicating approximately 26 to 30 stab wounds in her face, chest, and arms. The medical examiner later determined that she died from massive hemorrhaging caused by multiple stab wounds to the upper torso. Despite the ransacked appearance of the house, nothing had been stolen. Dorothy's purse, which was in plain view and contained cash, remained untouched. Her estimated time of death was around 1 a.m. that morning, and no murder weapon was found at the scene. Charles immediately became the prime suspect due to several factors. Investigators discovered that Dorothy had recently taken out an accidental death life insurance policy, with Charles named as the beneficiary. This raised immediate red flags, especially when combined with Charles's known financial difficulties. Additionally, police were particularly skeptical of the hitchhiker's story. They questioned how the stranger could have known where Charles lived to target his mother's house specifically. The hitchhiker would have had to walk approximately half a mile from the intersection, make a turn, pass several other homes with lights on, and then specifically target Charles's property, all after having just met him minutes earlier. The timeline also seemed problematic, as investigators initially believed it would have been nearly impossible for the man to walk to Charles's home and kill Dorothy in the time it took Charles to drive around and return home. When Charles was brought in for questioning, investigators noticed he had bruises on his face and marks around his wrists, which they interpreted as potential signs of a struggle. During initial questioning, Charles was heard saying to himself, "I can't believe he killed her," which investigators found suspicious. His refusal to take a polygraph test further heightened police suspicions. Despite their suspicions about Charles, investigators discovered crucial physical evidence that didn't match him. A partial bloody palm print was found on the stair banister, and a drop of blood was discovered on a light switch. When this evidence was tested, it was confirmed not to belong to either Dorothy or Charles. This DNA evidence became the cornerstone that would eventually solve the case, though it would take more than a decade to yield results. The investigation team initially theorized that Charles might have hired someone to kill his mother and then fabricated the hitchhiker story to cover up the hit. They also considered the possibility that the alleged hitchhiker had actually been the man Charles had hired to commit the murder. However, the DNA evidence consistently pointed away from Charles's involvement. Eventually, investigators interviewed people who had been at the Hardee's restaurant on the night of Dorothy's murder. These witnesses confirmed that Charles had indeed spoken to a black man in the parking lot and that this man had gotten into Charles's truck and driven away with him. This corroboration lent credibility to Charles's account of the evening's events. but the case would ultimately go cold for nearly 15 years. Throughout the investigation, Charles Holden remained under a cloud of suspicion despite the lack of physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The seemingly impossible coincidence of his story made it difficult for many to believe his account of events, leaving him in the difficult position of being the primary suspect in his own mother's brutal murder. The breakthrough in the case came in November 2005, when Delaware State Police entered the DNA evidence from the murder scene into the CODIS system. The results stated that the DNA belonged to 41-year-old Gilbert Cannon of Delmar, Maryland. Gilbert Cannon was a career criminal with an extensive rap sheet that included multiple convictions for theft, robbery, and substance charges. It took police 2.5 months to locate Cannon after receiving the DNA match. He was finally arrested on January 18, 2006 at a Selbyville apartment complex and was charged with first-degree murder. Cannon was held without bail at Sussex Correctional Institution near Georgetown while the case proceeded. When initially questioned about Dorothy's murder, Cannon denied any involvement in the crime. However, when investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence linking him to the scene and Charles's detailed account of giving him a ride that night, Cannon's story began to change. Faced with overwhelming physical evidence, Cannon eventually confessed to murdering Dorothy. Cannon confirmed that every detail of Charles Holden's seemingly unbelievable story was accurate. According to Cannon's statement to Detective Sergeant Keith Marvel, he had been high that night and had asked Charles for a ride to another town where he hoped to obtain more drugs. After their violent altercation at the intersection and Charles's escape, Cannon found himself stranded and under the influence of drugs. He began walking down the road, looking for an empty house where he could shelter for the night and sleep off his substance-induced state. Cannon told investigators that he passed several houses, but they all had lights on, so he avoided those properties. Dorothy's farmhouse was the first dark house he encountered, leading him to believe it was abandoned. That's when he broke into the house by shattering a window pane in the back door. When Dorothy awakened and saw his face, Cannon panicked, fearing she would be able to identify him to police. Still carrying the screwdriver he had taken from Charles's truck during their earlier fight, he put his hands over her mouth and pushed her back onto the bed. Cannon claimed he didn't remember the actual stabbing, saying he only remembered putting his hands over her mouth. However, police believe he stabbed the elderly woman repeatedly in a cocaine-fueled panic. Interestingly, Cannon confirmed that he had no idea the house belonged to the mother of the man who had given him a ride earlier that evening. The connection was purely coincidental. Cannon stated unequivocally that he acted alone and had no prior knowledge of either Dorothy or Charles Holden. Ultimately, in April 2007, Gilbert Cannon pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. Rather than face the death penalty, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea agreement brought closure to a case that had remained unsolved for nearly 16 years and finally vindicated Charles Holden, who had lived under suspicion for more than a decade.